Good morning to you. It's 7 o'clock. You're watching the Only Breakfast Show live from Westminster, and thousands of people have enjoyed a first night inside pubs and restaurants, but it could lead to tears with reports the government's considering localised restrictions with the Indian variant, threatening more lockdown easing next month. Plus, could a mass vaccination programme on 200 islands secure a summer getaway? We'll talk to the Environment Secretary, George Eustice, in a few minutes. Also for you this morning, the former Love Island star turned mental health advisor to the government, Dr. Alex George, is here to chat about his new book on the many ways we can look after our own well-being. Plus, if your four-legged friend has piled on the pounds during lockdown, we'll hear how they could get back in shape and become a star of the Canine Games. It's Tuesday, the 18th of May. Happy Mondays, a first taste of freedom as indoor hospitality resumes, but with fears of localised lockdowns if the Indian COVID variant spreads out of control.
I don't know what to expect, because the new variant on the loom, everything's kind of up in the air.
Airstrikes at dawn on Gaza City as President Biden calls for a ceasefire after 8 days of violence between Israel and Palestinian militants. Structural anomalies. Excavation work to begin at a cafe where police are searching for a missing girl linked to the serial killer Fred West. A root and branch review plans to treble tree planting in England over the next 3 years to tackle the effects of climate change.
Good morning. Our cool and changeable weather continues. Sunny spells and scattered showers, some of which could be heavy, slow-moving, with a risk of hail and thunder.
A very good morning to you. Now, while thousands across many parts of England, Scotland and Wales enjoyed a first taste of freedom in months as indoor hospitality reopened, there is increasing concern that localised restrictions could be imposed unless the Indian variant of COVID-19 is brought under control. 86 local authorities have reported outbreaks of the new strain, threatening the next stage of lockdown easing on the 21st of June. Becky Johnson reports.
Cheers!
Finally being allowed to have a night out inside a pub was cause for celebration. As restaurants prepared to give customers a taste of what they'd been missing. These diners in Birmingham felt they'd earned their newfound freedom.
We've been so good, you know, we've obeyed everything, and now we've all been second vaccinated, and it's just so fabulous.
It was opening night for theatres, able to welcome back audiences after months of uncertainty.
The fact that venues like this can host nights for people to get out and performing again is just so exciting for us, performers, and for people as well. I feel like it's really missed to see live music.
And cinemas reopened too. Going to see a film with friends never felt like such a treat. But a rise in cases of the Indian variant is causing concern at a time when business owners were expecting to feel more optimistic about the months ahead.
To be honest with you, I don't know what to expect, because the new variant on the loom, everything's kind of up in the air. Customers, you'll get some confident customers that have had their vaccine that are confident to come back out, and you'll have those that are quite reluctant as they don't know how transmissible or how dangerous the new variant is.
Allowing indoor mixing at a time when a new variant is spreading is seen by many as a risk. And scientists will be watching closely over the coming days and weeks to see what impact it has.
One thing we've all learnt is nothing is certain. And for now, people are determined to celebrate the freedoms they have. Becky Johnson, Sky News in Birmingham.
President Biden has spoken to the Israeli Prime Minister and urged both sides in the Middle East conflict to agree a ceasefire. There have been further airstrikes in Gaza overnight, as well as an exchange of rocket and artillery fire across the border between Lebanon and Israel. For the 2 million people who live in Gaza, life has become very difficult in the last week as they deal with airstrikes and power cuts. Mark Stone reports from Jerusalem.
This is the view from the Keek family home. Next door, the Hadidis once lived. A family now without a mother and 4 of her sons. The Keeks somehow survived. 3 generations and holding together just. The sound is the Israeli drones. They've been low overhead through the day, hitting targets across the strip. Mohammed Keek is 25. The weight of one family's struggle is on him.
والكهرباء فيش بتجيك ساعة وبتقطع يعني فيش لازمنا نشغل على خط المولد والاسلاك رايحة فيش عندنا كهرباء ولا في عندنا نت ولا في عندنا مية ولا في عندنا أي شيء واش بدنا نعمل يعني هذا زلمة عمره 81 سنة إيه كان هنا الحيطة ضربت الشباك ضرب عليه أنا كنت نايم جنبه الحيطان كلها وقعت علينا الثلاجة طار علينا لما قمت أنا صحيته هو هذا بيعرف يرمي صواريخ هو هذا بيعمل ما هذا مدني هذا من بير في السن إيش بده يعمل أنتوا تضربوا في حق المدنيين.
Then there is the other generation, his daughters. How do you explain to them why their neighbours, their friends, are dead? There is no innocence in Gaza. There is water here, but it no longer comes out of the taps. The bombing has damaged the mains pipes. It's taken out the electricity supply too. It's down to a maximum of 2 hours a day now, and there is little fuel for the generators. This is Islam, Mohammed's sister.
So bad, so scaring. So bad.
The UN-run schools are a focal point. Classrooms are now bedrooms for the many hundreds of families whose houses are destroyed and the thousands more who are too frightened to be home. The families here tell us there has been an airstrike every 5 minutes. For a population locked in and already 70% dependent on aid and food, this is devastating. But with footage like this as evidence of what they say are as precise strikes as possible, the Israeli military claim they have killed 130 Palestinian militants. This, they say, is the targeting of a small Hamas submarine. And this was, for Israel, a prize. They claim they killed a top commander. Hussam Abu Habib was, for 15 years, a leader within the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Yet, despite all this, there is no sign a week on that either side is prepared to stop, not even for aid to get in. Israel calls this proportionate and civilian deaths regrettable. Hamas says it is the defender of the Palestinian people. The cycle goes on. Mark Stone, Sky News, in Jerusalem.
Well, Alex Rossi is in Jerusalem for us this morning. I mean, do you think the calls from President Biden, Alex, are falling on deaf ears at the moment?
I think it is, at this stage, quite difficult to read exactly what that means from President Biden. He has spoken with Netanyahu a few times since this conflict began, but this is the first time that he has expressed support for a ceasefire, and that is very carefully worded. He stops short of calling for an immediate ceasefire, and there are a number of ways of reading that. One is perhaps he doesn't want to be defied by Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, Israel is a close ally. To call for an immediate ceasefire and then for it to be ignored would be devastating. But perhaps more likely, he's giving the Israeli military, the Israeli state, a bit more time to achieve their tactical objectives inside Gaza. It may be that we are, as a result of this phone call, entering a new phase, perhaps a winding down phase where the mediation will be ramped up and towards the end of the week you will get a ceasefire. But that perhaps is hopeful. If you listen to what Benjamin Netanyahu is saying, if you listen to all of the stuff on the surface, well, it doesn't appear to be heading in that direction at all. He has said it will take some time and the operations over Gaza will continue. Now, Israeli Air Force struck many targets in Gaza overnight, attacking what they call in defence circles the metro system. This is the underground network of tunnels which Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups use to move their fighters around and launch rockets. Sirens are once again ringing out over southern Israel in the early hours of this morning and throughout the morning as more rockets are being launched. But the number of rockets being launched is fewer, and the distance that they are travelling is also less, which suggests that certainly on the Hamas side, they want to try and de-escalate this and head towards a ceasefire. That, of course, could change dramatically. We heard overnight Hamas giving a warning to the Israelis that if they continue to attack high-rise buildings, they will once again launch rockets towards central Israel and Tel Aviv, which again would ramp up the escalation massively and continue this cycle of violence. We're not at the end yet. It could continue for some time. Remember, of course, in 2014, it went on for nearly 7 weeks. But the hope is, of course, that the mediation will work and we will head towards a ceasefire towards the end of the week. But we're not at that point yet.
OK, Alex, thank you. Some breaking news this morning, and the unemployment figures for the 3 months to February have just been released. So let's get all the details from our business correspondent, Paul Kelso. What do they tell us, Paul?
Good morning, Stephen. They tell us there are some glimmers of hope in the employment market after a dreadful 14 months. We saw so many businesses reopening indoors yesterday, didn't we? That so many people returning to work for the first time, and that's borne out a little by these numbers. The employment rate for the 3 months to February was 4.8. The unemployment rate, forgive me, was 4.8%. That is 0.3% lower than in the previous quarter. So fewer people unemployed. There's also some slightly more recent data that the Office for National Statistics have provided on the number of people on payrolls in April. That is, people receiving a paycheck through the taxation system. There are nearly 100,000 more people on payrolls in April than there were in March, thanks, the ONS say, and perhaps it's obvious, isn't it? Lockdown began to ease, and they say a lot of those jobs were in the hospitality and entertainment sectors where work could begin to return to something like normal. Now, the Office for National Statistics say these numbers show the employment market is stable with signs of recovery, which is precisely what the Chancellor will have been wanting to hear from these numbers. We know the furlough scheme, which has been propping up the whole labour market for so long, it's going to start to taper off. Businesses are going to start to have to pay towards that at the end of June. It will end entirely in September. Now, the very strong message from businesses I was talking to yesterday, particularly in hospitality, was that if that June 21st next step in the lockdown, in the roadmap, doesn't happen, they want that support extended. So we're in the teeth of the crucial part of this big economic gamble, removing the furlough as jobs return. Will it save people from ending up on the dole queue?
OK, Paul, thank you. Well, let's get more now on the warnings around the spread of the new variant of COVID-19, the Indian variant. Let's talk to the Environment Secretary, George Eustice. Good to see you this morning. Look, a lot of people were celebrating last night, and understandably so. It does raise concerns, though, doesn't it, to be reopening things up, to be opening society and opening the economy at a time when we know this pretty dangerous variant is actually spreading in the country.
Well, look, that is why we are taking things one step at a time, taking things cautiously, if you like. We've done the next stage of reopening. The overall prevalence of the virus is now very low in this country. There are these hotspots, particularly around places like Bolton, where the variant that was first discovered in India has been detected. I know that Matt Hancock said that we've done some research into that variant. The vaccine does seem to be effective against it, but it does seem to have a higher transmission rate. And the greatest defence we've really got is to ensure that people continue to get their vaccinations, that we roll out that programme, that people in those areas who might have chosen not to get the vaccine so far do now get it.
Yeah, I mean, vaccine hesitancy actually within that area and amongst black and ethnic minority communities does seem to be pretty high at the moment. I think the uptake in one particular area affected by this variant is 37%, which is just not good enough, is it? How do you begin to really now tackle that hesitancy issue?
Well, we've been doing a lot in recent months to get those communities who are a bit more hesitant to engage with this programme to have the vaccine. I think maybe in those areas when they see the resurgence of the virus, it may prompt them to think, actually, this is serious, the vaccine is effective, it is preventing the spread of this in other areas, so now let's get it. And we just need to keep redoubling our efforts in some of those hard-to-reach communities to get them to see that having the vaccine for all of us is the best way out of this terrible pandemic.
Do we need more sort of voices from these affected communities to come up and speak, do we think?
Well, a lot of work is being done in those communities, and it has been, quite effective in getting uptake. But yes, there are still pockets where uptake is low, and there's no shortcut to this. We've just got to redouble our efforts to get community leaders, faith leaders in some of those BAME communities to really encourage people to come forward and have the vaccine.
Where are we in terms of the whole vaccine process? I know it's gone very well for the age groups that have been targeted so far, but this highlights, doesn't it, a need to get this process sped up to an extent.
Well, we've been running it at a phenomenal rate, to be honest. We now have close to 70% of the population have had their first jab, approaching now, I think 40% have even had their second jab. We've reduced now the timescale between those two from 12 weeks initially now down to 8 weeks so that we can speed up the rollout of that second jab, because we think that with this new variant discovered first in India, that there is additional protection, if you like, from that second jab, and the second jab becomes more important. So we're trying to condense those scales and get the second jabs out as soon as we can.
I was talking to Kwasi Kwarteng yesterday, and he was saying that it is, he thinks, still very likely that the next stage of lockdown easing, I mean, the full lifting of everything on June 21st, could still go ahead. I mean, are you as confident as the business secretary?
Well, we want it to go ahead. The whole plan about this,
it to, but...
of course, but we cannot rule anything out, and that is why the Prime Minister said we will take this a step at a time, as we have one set of easements, and just yesterday we've had a further set of easements, opened more parts of the economy. We need to see how that beds down over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then shortly before the 21st of June, we'll be in a position to assess whether we can go to that next stage. We want to do that. That's always been the plan. We want each step to be an irreversible step, but we can never rule out that there may have to be a delay.
I mean, with that in mind, is the government actively looking at, fully opening on the 21st, whilst imposing, if necessary, local restrictions on areas that are still struggling? Is that an option?
That would be an option, and we cannot rule anything out, obviously, at this stage. But our preferred outcome is that we really double down and get the vaccination rates up in those areas that are seeing these problems, so that we can give them the immunity that they need to this virus, and then we won't have to have any such local lockdowns.
Now, again, talking to Kwasi Kwarteng yesterday, he wasn't particularly in favour of the idea that certainly in places like Bolton and Blackburn, they seem to be, should we say, bending the rules a little bit on who can be getting vaccinated, finding a reason to vaccinate anyone who wants to come forward. What's your view on that? Because if that is going to tackle the problem, and these are worrying hotspots, don't we just need to get as many people jabbed up as possible?
Well, we do need to get as many jabbed as possible, but also the advice that we have from the Joint Committee on Vaccinations, who advise us on this, is that if you divert effort to vaccinating very young cohorts, people in, say, their 20s, at the expense of vaccinating those in their 30s or 40s,
if they've got
you are risking that.
But if they've got the supplies, if they've locally got the supplies, it's not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
Well, I mean, there will be lots of already cases where if they've got supplies and they can do it, then they will push people through faster. But to have a conscious decision to say vaccinate the whole population in those areas, when actually there are still many people in the cohorts of 35 and above who've maybe not had the vaccine, the right thing to do is to get those over the age of 35 to have the vaccine, since it's the older you are, the more at risk you are.
I'm just intrigued. You say 35. My understanding is it's currently 36 at the moment. Is it dropping down to 35 today?
It's dropping regularly, I think.
Will it drop today?
I don't think it'll drop today, but it's but I don't know exactly what the update of the program. But it's moving. All I'd say is on almost a daily basis, moving down the age range.
Yeah. Look, can we talk about Brexit a little bit. I mean, we have to be very careful, don't we, about Brexit now that we've gone past all these hurdles. We have to be very careful, don't we, that any trade deals that we're now working on do not negatively impact groups in the UK. I mean, particularly that hugely important groups like the British farming sector.
Well, and that's always the case in all trade agreements. You go into these, we think there's great opportunities. We're very keen, for instance, to pursue trade agreements with Australia and also with the United States and with other countries as well. And but always in any trade agreement, yes, there's a balance to be struck between your commercial interests and your desire to open up free markets.
Is there a danger then with, for example, Australia, if there was a free trade deal, that would potentially negatively impact the British farming sector, wouldn't it?
Well, look, there are huge amounts of things that a country like Australia produces that are currently subject to tariffs because that's what we had in the European Union. But we're not even a producer and we can offer them tariff-free access in those areas. Everything from nectarines to almond nuts, where they're a big producer, and also, of course, wine.
What about the areas where we are a producer?
Well, it's a standard thing in any trade agreement that where you have what are called sensitive sectors. That's particular areas where there might be economic impacts to having a trade agreement. Well, there are well-established ways to manage that, where you can have what's called a tariff rate quota, or if you like, a tariff-free envelope at a set volume. So there's ways of dealing with all of these things.
But is it right that the International Trade Secretary is pushing for a zero tariff approach with Australia across the board?
Well, look, I'm not going to get into discussions that are going on in government about individual trade agreements.
You're not happy, though, are you?
No, in any discussion on any part of government policy, and trade agreements are no exception, there's a discussion and there's a consensus. And at the moment, there's a very clear consensus in government that we want to do a trade agreement with countries like Australia, but obviously on the right terms.
Is it fair to say, then, that you've had some robust discussions, as reported in the FT today?
I have very good discussions with all of my cabinet colleagues on all issues where we've got a shared agenda.
I think the smile says it all. That's a fair assessment, isn't it?
No, I mean, of course, in any discussion on any part of government policy, there will be issues where different government departments have a shared interest, and we obviously have a discussion in order to establish a consensus.
OK. Looking post-pandemic, how do we start to properly rebuild the economy? It's going to take a lot of work. How do we rebuild the economy and rebuild it greener?
Well, we've been setting out today, and I'm doing a big speech later today about nature and the environment. We want to put a much bigger focus on nature, so we are announcing a strategy on peat, which will include a ban on the sale and use of horticultural peat in garden centres, and a really big ambition to treble the amount of trees that we plant.
OK. Look, Minister, it's good to talk to you this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. OK, also in the headlines this morning, President Biden has said the United States will donate a further 20 million doses of coronavirus vaccines to the rest of the world. For the first time, President Biden will give away injections previously destined for domestic use. Scientists say they've developed a way of using artificial intelligence to predict the possible risk of someone having a heart attack. Researchers in the United States claim the machine can use time and weather patterns even to report when a cardiac arrest is more likely. Cancer charities say trans and non-binary people need to be encouraged to come forward for cervical checks. They say many patients face barriers, including the fact that transgender men or non-binary people assigned female at birth are less likely to be invited to screening appointments. Teaching unions say staff should not be responsible for running coronavirus track and trace systems in school. The NAHT School Leaders Union are warning that more staff could leave the profession after some heads of schools spent more than 100 hours identifying positive cases. Now, if you live anywhere but London, you've probably seen these scattered about the roads, but now an official trial of e-scooter rentals is going to be held in London. It's the first time they've been legally allowed on the capital's roads and cycle paths. They'll have a maximum speed of 12.5 miles an hour. Believe you me, they get everywhere. The pop star Ariana Grande has confirmed she's got married, pretty much in secret. The 27-year-old and her husband, Dalton Gomez, are reported to have had what was described as a tiny and intimate ceremony with just 20 people in California. Now, today marks 15 years since the death of Kian Prince, the young Queen's Park Rangers player who was stabbed trying to break up a fight outside his school. Well, now advanced technology has created an avatar of what would be a 30-year-old now that he could have been if he'd really gone on to play in the top leagues, highlighting the impact, they hope, of knife crime. Jemima Walker reports.
Aged 15, Kian's dreams of becoming a professional football player were snatched away. Now, thanks to deep fake technology, input from scientists and his family, he's been re-signed by his former club and will make his debut as a FIFA player. Kian's father hopes the image of his son fulfilling his childhood dream will inspire vulnerable young people.
A young black boy whose life was taken too early, and it's demonstrated to all the young people who love playing FIFA that young people with knives in their hands is creating this, where you are robbing your community, robbing your country, robbing your society from seeing people that look like yourself reach their destiny, seeing them achieve their goals.
Since his son was fatally stabbed after intervening in a fight, Dr. Prince has dedicated his life to combating knife crime through the Kian Prince Foundation. He says there needs to be more investment in early preventative measures. After Kian died, the law was changed to increase the age that you could buy a knife from 16 to 18. But 15 years on, the issue of knife crime still persists, and in many cases, it's getting worse. So what role do clubs like this play in tackling it?
Get a student who might struggle a bit at school, put them in a football ground. Suddenly it's a completely different environment, and they're mesmerised by it. And this is the dream come true. We always tell our young players coming through, a lot of you may not make it as a professional football player. That doesn't mean, one, you can't make a living in football, or two, you can't make a decent living in something else, because we'll make sure you have some skill sets when you leave here that no matter what you decide to do, you can be successful in doing that.
Kian's killer could soon be released from prison. First, Kian's father wants to meet him.
Let's support and help the guy to be able to make the change so he doesn't continue the cycle. There's no point us hating on him. We might as well support him so he can maybe be an example to other children so they can see where not to go wrong.
Jemima Walker, Sky News.
Well, this is Sky News Breakfast. Let's have a look at the weather for you now with Kirsty.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. Cool and changeable outlook continues with sunny spells and scattered showers. Again, some will be heavy and thundery. Already some rumbles of thunder today across parts of northwest England, parts of Wales as well. And down towards the southwest, we've got some bands of showers here. Otherwise, for many, it is a dry start to the day. A few mist and fog patches lifting quite quickly. And in the far north of Scotland and the Northern Isles, a weak weather front here will bring some rain and drizzle. And that'll move southwards into the mainland through the day. Sunshine and showers developing pretty widely yet again. In the south is where we'll see some of the heavier, more thundery downpours with the risk of hail, quite slow moving as well. The showers easing into the evening to leave another largely dry and chilly night.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Kirsty, thank you. Still to come on Sky News Breakfast, Labour are calling for the government to do more to help homeowners whose property has unsafe cladding. We'll talk to the Shadow Housing Secretary in a few minutes.
should protect our heritage. Unfortunately, it will become part of Azerbaijan.
This monastery is under the protection, for now, the next 5 years at least, of Russian peacekeepers. I'm Diana Magny, and I'm Sky's Russia correspondent, based here in Moscow. I witnessed the despair of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh who were digging up the soil of their dead relatives. It's Armenians who've abandoned these villages now. Quite what their strategy is, I'm not sure, but they have made some arrests already today.
They can't kill everyone, they can't shoot everyone, they can't arrest everybody.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. I mean, this clearly says, I love Hitler. Are you saying that doesn't say Hitler? Russia insists that its military build-up in the Arctic is purely defensive.
Well, breaking news this morning, and the Environment Secretary George Eustice has just confirmed there may be a delay to the next easing of lockdown restrictions. It follows concerns over rising levels of infection from the Indian variant of coronavirus. So a few minutes ago, Mr Eustice told us the government had to remain cautious and flexible when it comes to the current plan to relax the rules next month.
We want it to go ahead. The whole plan about this, of course, but we cannot rule anything out, and that is why the Prime Minister said we will take this a step at a time, as we have one set of easements, and just yesterday we've had a further set of easements, opened more parts of the economy. We need to see how that beds down over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then shortly before the 21st of June, we'll be in a position to assess whether we can go to that next stage. We want to do that. That's always been the plan. We want each step to be an irreversible step, but we can never rule out that there may have to be a delay.
Well, let's talk to our political correspondent, Kate McCann. I mean, that's the key thing, isn't it? Not ruling anything out at this stage.
Yeah, and I think when he was talking to you, you got a real sense, didn't you, about what the government is going to do over the next couple of weeks. After we've seen the unlocking this week, the plan really is to watch and wait and to look at the data to see how it's being affected by this Indian variant and then to make that decision. I thought it was fascinating, actually, that he basically said to you that the decision on June 21st could come really quite close to that date. We may not get very much notice at all. And perhaps that's to be expected because while those rates of the Indian variant are quite low, case numbers are still quite low. And it's important to remember that so people don't get too overly worried. The concern is about what the vaccine is going to do, how it's going to react, and whether it's going to hold up and be protective against this variant, which we now know is dominant in at least 2 areas of the country and spreading into others. There was another portion of that interview that was really interesting when George Eustice was talking about local lockdowns, though. Now, we know that that in government is something that they would really like to avoid, but he said to you that it's something that they won't rule out. It is a potential that is being looked at as a contingency plan, not just pushing that June 21st date back, but possibly making local areas stick to different rules if they have higher rates of this Indian variant. And I suppose that's what we're going to see over the next couple of weeks, is the discussion move to how we can potentially stop that spread and what that might mean for all of us going forward.
OK, Kate, thank you. Well, Labour is warning that lives and livelihoods could be at risk if the government doesn't do more to help homeowners whose property has unsafe cladding. They say developers should be given a deadline to remove all combustible material. All of this, of course, in the wake of the tragedy at Grenfell, of course. Let's talk to the Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, Lucy Powell. Good to see you this morning. Look, what exactly do you want to see happen here?
Well, we're going to be calling a vote in Parliament today, an amendment to the Queen's speech, calling on the government to act to save lives and livelihoods. We want to see a deadline now put in place because there's just not been the urgency about this situation. So we want to see a deadline of June 2022 for all dangerous cladding and other materials to be removed from the outside of buildings. That would be 5 years since the Grenfell tragedy. And we also want to see enshrined in legislation protection for leaseholders and others, other residents, from having to pay the cost of this remediation work and removing the dangerous cladding. The government decided not to enshrine that in legislation, despite a number of votes in the House of Commons in recent weeks. And now really is the time for them to make absolutely clear that that isn't going to be the case. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a terrible fire in the New Providence Wharf in East London that was covered in the same dangerous cladding that Grenfell Tower was covered in. And really, this should now be a real wake-up call for the government that it's got to act with a much greater sense of urgency.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real problem, isn't there, that people are now sort of own houses that are unsellable, so that they're stuck in their accommodation. But the costs for this are absolutely huge, aren't they? I mean, who's going to pay for it?
Well, the costs are large at the moment. I mean, one of the issues is we don't know to what extent the costs are because the government has not, in this whole last 4 years, actually undertaken a full nationwide audit of which buildings are most at risk with what kind of remediation work that is necessary. So we aren't sure what the costs really are. The government have recently increased the Building Safety Fund to £5 billion, and we welcome that. But there are lots of issues with that fund in terms of the scope, the timetable, and it's being done on a first-come, first-served basis. But actually, what the government should be doing is doing this full audit of every building, like they did in Australia and other places. And then what they should be doing is also going after the developers and the building owners to pay the cost of this remediation work, so it doesn't all fall on the taxpayer. But we're also calling for a national task force on this area because the whole system, as you say, is now broken. People can't insure, can't sell their properties. The whole system of risk assessment, of regulation, of oversight is broken and it isn't working. And the government has to lead that process by bringing together a task force of all the players to let's fix this market so that people who've done the right thing in buying their own home and now through no fault of their own are finding themselves on the verge of bankruptcy, and the government have got to act.
Can I ask you about coronavirus? I mean, you're a North West MP, and obviously a lot of the concern over the Indian variant is happening in the North West. What should happen now? Do we delay the 21st of June potentially? Do we stick to that and locally lock down areas that are badly affected? Do we vaccinate everybody in those areas? What would your plan be for your constituents?
Well, as you say, there are some worrying trends with this new variant that it does seem to be transmitting more quickly than previous variants. As you say, it's still relatively small amounts across the country, but in some places it's very spreading quite quickly now indeed. I think it's too early to say about what should happen in June, but what we have been calling for here in Greater Manchester and nationally is that we really do motor on with some surge vaccinations as well as surge testing, focusing on places like Bolton and Blackburn, where the Indian variant is now significantly on the rise. And the government are always, I'm afraid, a little bit slow to act on these issues. And we are really concerned about the timing of India going on the red list in the first place. So I think we would all, especially those of us in Greater Manchester, we would all be very reluctant and wary to go down a road of local lockdowns. They didn't really work last time, but they became incredibly difficult and divisive for those areas that were put in early lockdown. And poor old Bolton and Blackburn, have really been at the forefront of this for the last year. So I think, let's get that surge vaccination, surge testing capacity in very, very quickly into these areas, and hopefully we'll be able to see some of this off.
Okay, Lucy Powell, good to talk to you. Thank you. Now, police in Gloucester investigating the disappearance of a woman thought to have been killed by Fred West say there's enough evidence to start excavating a cafe in the city. Let's talk to our correspondent, Dan Whitehead, who joins us now. Bring us up to date, Dan.
Yeah, we had a statement last night from Gloucestershire Police who've been outside the Clean Plate Cafe here in the centre of Gloucester, confirming that they are now going to be starting excavation work. It's after their forensic archaeologists confirmed that they have found over the last week, as they've been assessing the cellar of this cafe, structural anomalies, and they will now work to establish whether there are human remains. This all links to the disappearance of 15-year-old Mary Bastholm, who went missing back in 1968. She was working a shift here at the age of 15 at the cafe under a different name then, and went missing when waiting for a bus nearby. Her disappearance has long been linked to the serial killer Fred West, who of course was charged with 12 murders of young women between the 60s and 80s. He committed suicide while pending trial back in 1995. Now, this all came to light around a week or so ago after a production company which was filming a TV documentary on the case here at the cafe had discovered some evidence. That evidence, we now know, included some blue material. Now, Mary was wearing a blue coat as she left the cafe on the day that she disappeared. The police were called in after these findings by the TV production company. This tent has been in place outside the cafe since then, and clearly now they believe they have sufficient evidence to warrant excavation work. Now, they say that that is not going to start until this Wednesday at the very earliest, and that it will last several weeks. This, of course, is painstaking work, and the disappearance of Mary is more than 50 years ago now, so exactly what remains will be found, if any, remains to be seen. There are newspaper reports this morning that human bones, or what thought were human bones, were discovered by the production company. That has been denied by the police. Just to bring you as well a statement that we have had from Mary's family on this update. They say that we are extremely happy Gloucestershire Constabulary is continuing to try and search for Mary and gives us a chance to potentially put her at rest after all these years. We hope this is a chance to finally get closure for Mary and would like to continue to ask for privacy whilst the excavation is ongoing. That excavation will start, we understand, later this week.
OK, Dan, thank you. Now, the government plans to treble tree planting rates in England to reach 7,000 hectares of new woodland a year as part of efforts to tackle the climate crisis. It's going to offer multi-million-pound tree planting grants to provide more incentives for landowners and farmers. Becky Cottrell reports.
These young trees are set to become a vital part of this farm's ecosystem. Small willow saplings are being planted not in a wood, but in a vegetable field. This is agroforestry.
We all know that trees capture carbon, but they're also a massive tool for farmers. They can provide you extra crops above your vegetable crops, such as apples and pears and things like that, like we do here. But they can also, they provide wind protection for my crops.
These trees don't just capture emissions, they also attract songbirds that get rid of the insects that attack the crops, meaning there's no need for chemical pesticides. So planting here is efficient, sustainable, and it makes financial sense. The government is offering agroforestry grants, but farmers already using this technique say funds have to be managed in the right way.
It's not about planting as many trees as possible. 50 really well-planted trees, really well looked after for the first 5 years of their life, are just as good as 100 trees really badly planted.
But the government does want to talk numbers. They aim to plant 3 times as many trees in England by 2024, creating 7,000 hectares of new woodland every year. Across the UK, we need to plant 30,000 hectares annually over the next 3 years to help us reach net zero emissions by 2050. But the Woodland Trust says demand for housing is undermining green initiatives.
We can actually see mature trees cut down for new homes, and then people come along and say, how can we introduce more greenery to this site? And that's been a huge missed opportunity there. And obviously, keeping mature trees delivers a much better gain than planting small ones, which will take decades to deliver.
Government, campaigners and many landowners say farms need to be used to reduce emissions. But growers like Andy worry food production will be driven abroad to meet planting targets at home, unless farmers are given the support he says they need to help us become carbon neutral. Becky Cottrell, Sky News, Gloucestershire.
And just to remind you, watch the Sky News Daily Climate Show at 6:30 and 9:30 every weekday here on Sky News. Now, still to come for you this morning, what is the best way to make sure that COVID vaccines reach those most in need around the world? We'll try to find out for you in a couple of minutes.
Really what we're saying in this paper is at the same time, we should be making sure that we're keeping vaccination production going so that we can vaccinate those parts of the world that at present don't have access to vaccines. They urgently need them, and it's in our own interest that they do get vaccinated, because the biggest problem we now have is that even if we do everything, which we are doing now, to vaccinate our own people, if you get variants, new types of COVID disease that arise in different parts of the world, the risk is that they then come back into our own country. And you can see this obviously with the Indian variant now. So the important thing is at the same time as we're vaccinating our own people, what we do is we've set out a plan, a detailed plan for the international community to make sure we're maximizing production and distribution to all parts of the world, at least so that in those parts of the world that are the poorest, and where they don't have enough vaccine at present, we vaccinate at least the most vulnerable, the key workers, and the big urban populations, because that will stop the spread of the virus to other parts of the world. The governments are the only ones that can coordinate how you increase the vaccination production. So, for example, it's important to make sure that some of the production of vaccine at the moment, there's vaccine being produced for other types of condition, that we're repurposing some of that. And that really requires government to help negotiate that with the big pharma companies so that you can increase the amount of COVID vaccine and get it distributed. You also need government because, for example, at the moment in Africa, you've got about 1.2 billion people. You've got roughly, I'm afraid, at the moment, just over 30 million doses of vaccine delivered for the entire continent. We need to make sure that we're getting more vaccine to the African continent by maximizing the supply of vaccine. But the additional problem you have is that of that over 30 million, only a small part of it has yet been actually used for the population. So you also need to work with governments so that they're able to absorb the vaccine they're being given and vaccinate their population effectively.
For the early risers.
We examine the story beyond the headline.
For the knowledge seekers.
Welcome to Divided States.
For the straight talkers. The curious and the ones who want to be entertained.
Backstage, Sky News' entertainment podcast.
For wherever you are.
Welcome to Sophie Ridge on Sunday podcast.
For the ones who want to know more.
Welcome to the All Out Politics podcast.
For the listeners.
From Sky News Storycast.
Sky News Podcasts. Listen and subscribe for free.
Did you know symptoms of hay fever can develop at any stage of life, not just in childhood? The Pollen Reports, sponsored by Philips Connected Air Purifiers.
For many places, it's a cool and changeable outlook of sunny spells and scattered showers. A largely dry start, but we have got thicker cloud in the far north of Scotland, bringing some light rain here. And elsewhere, the showers will develop through the day. Some of them could be heavy and thundery. Temperatures will be around the mid-teens. Most of the showers will begin to fade as we head into the evening. Now we've got tree pollen at the moment, low to moderate across the UK and Ireland, low levels for Wales and northeast Scotland. Elsewhere, levels rising to moderate. It's birch, ash and oak for many, with some plane in the cities, and the spores will increase temporarily after the rain.
The Pollen Reports, sponsored by Philips Connected Air Purifiers.
Now, a committee of MPs today begins investigating the best way to ensure the world's poorest people get vaccinated against COVID-19. Well, someone who's going to be giving evidence today is Heidi Chow, who's Senior Campaigns and Policy Manager at Global Justice Now. Good to see you. Look, I mean, what does a country like the UK need to do, in your opinion?
Good morning, Stephen. Yeah, I think that the UK needs to support the suspension of patents at the World Trade Organization. What we're seeing right now is a grotesque level of inequality around vaccine access. And so 82% of global vaccinations have been administered in high-income countries like the UK, but only 0.2% of global vaccinations have taken place in low-income countries. And the reason why this is because essentially we are facing a supply problem that's been created because of pharmaceutical monopolies. And so only AstraZeneca can make the AstraZeneca vaccine, only Pfizer can make the Pfizer vaccine. And these monopolies are sustained by intellectual property rules such as patents, but also through companies guarding their know-how and their technology.
I mean, a lot of these companies, not all, but I mean, certainly AstraZeneca has provided the vaccine at cost to some countries, hasn't it?
Yeah, so AstraZeneca has offered a price pledge of non-profit pricing to countries in the global south. However, we've noticed that this price pledge has several holes in it. So first of all, we've noticed that some lower and middle income countries have actually paid several times higher than the EU price for the vaccine. And also that we've discovered that there's an expiry date on this price pledge. And so they can withdraw this price pledge as soon as they determine when the pandemic is over. And according to reports, that could be as soon as July 2021. And actually, the price is just one issue. Actually, the main issue, as I mentioned, is that we are facing a restriction of supply because we have these pharmaceutical monopolies in place. And actually, if you're in a pandemic, you sort of need the opposite of monopolies. Instead of restricting supplies, we should be enabling as many manufacturers as possible across the world to be making these vaccines and ramping up production so that there are enough doses for all countries.
I mean, are there enough facilities to start producing a generic version then of these vaccines?
Yeah, so we've heard reports of vaccine manufacturers in countries like Bangladesh, Canada, South Africa, Denmark, who are all standing ready to help produce the vaccines. And actually, they're saying to pharmaceutical corporations that hold the patents, they're saying, please let us help make these vaccines to help in the global effort to ramp up production, because at the moment there just simply are not enough doses to go around. And what we've seen is high-income countries like the UK, like the US, like the EU, who've actually hoarded doses in advance. And so actually what limited supplies there are, they've been swooped up by high-income countries.
Can I ask about business profits? I mean, it's a difficult issue at a time when something like this is going on. You sort of think, well, you just need to forget about all of that. The problem is these big pharmaceuticals spend billions on research and development, so they can't be expected just to give everything away, can they?
Well, actually, the 6 front-runner vaccines that we're seeing have actually been largely funded by public funding. They've had around the tune of $10 billion committed to their research and development. And actually, in global terms, we've seen over $100 billion go into the research and development of COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. And so there's a really strong argument that actually these are already people's vaccines, that actually these have been funded, R&D have been funded by the public. The public have funded the clinical trials these vaccines have been tested on members of the public. Governments have funded at-risk manufacturing, and even pharmaceutical corporations have negotiated liability indemnity with certain governments. And so actually the public sector has had a massive role in the research and development and bringing these vaccines to market.
Heidi, really good to talk to you. Thank you.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. It's another cool and changeable day with sunny spells and scattered showers, some of which will be heavy and thundery, just like the past few days. This morning, though, for most, it's a dry start. Already the showers gathering in parts of southwest England, northwest England, and some rain and drizzle coming to the very far north of Scotland and the Northern Isles. Otherwise, the showers developing as the day gets going. Some of them heavy and slow moving, could merge to longer spells of rain, and the greatest risk of hail and thunder always towards the south. Top temperatures into the mid-teens. The showers easing as we go through the evening, may linger for a time in the east, and then a bit of a chilly night to come where we have clear spells. Bit more rain across central and northern Scotland tomorrow, and showers developing elsewhere.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.